In Chicago, people learned fear early. They learned which streets to avoid, which voices to lower, and which names not to say out loud. Al Capone was one of those names. To most people, he was power. To some, protection. To many, a threat they pretended not to see. But to one child, he was none of those things. This is a story about a meeting that wasn't supposed to happen, about a child who spoke without knowing who he was speaking to, and about a man who for the first time was seen without the shadow that followed him everywhere. As this story unfolds, you'll meet not just the child, but his family. A home shaped by quiet struggles, a father carrying pride and fear in equal measure, a mother who understands exactly what Capone's name can do to a life. And you'll see how a single, innocent connection slowly pulls a powerful man closer to a world he never belonged to and never fully understood. Stay until the end, because this story isn't about what Al Capone did, it's about what he almost did and why he stopped. And before we begin, tell us where you're watching from.
The boy frowned. Capone's eyes moved across the room calmly. He noticed everything: the exit, the spacing, the way fear arranged itself. And then he noticed the child. The boy was staring, not rudely, not challengingly, but openly, with the simple curiosity of someone who had not yet learned to look away. Capone slowed his step. The boy wiped his hands on his apron and spoke before anyone else could. "Counter or table?" The sound of his voice cut cleanly through the tension. Capone stopped. For a moment, no one breathed. Capone looked down at the boy, really looked. Small frame, steady eyes, no fear, no recognition. "Counter," Capone said. The boy nodded and wiped the counter carefully, the way his mother had taught him. Capone sat. The stool creaked. Someone in the back shifted nervously. The boy reached for a glass. "Water?" Capone nodded again. The boy poured, concentrating. He placed the glass down gently. "What'll you have?" he asked. Capone leaned back slightly. "What's good?" The boy considered. "Soup's good today." Capone smiled faintly. "Soup, it is." Behind the counter, the boy's father watched, heart pounding. He wanted to speak, to stop this, to pull his son away, but his legs wouldn't move. The cook ladled soup with shaking hands. The boy leaned on the counter, waiting. Capone studied him. "You work here every day?" "Most days, after school." Capone's gaze flicked toward the man behind the counter. He saw the resemblance now, the pride, the tension. "You like it?" Capone asked. The boy shrugged. "It's ours." That word stayed with Capone. Ours. The soup arrived. The boy placed it in front of Capone and stepped back. Capone tasted it. "He's right," he said quietly. "It's good." The cook exhaled without realizing it. The boy smiled, satisfied. Around them, the diner existed in a suspended state. Everyone waited for something, a signal, a shift. Capone glanced around. "Why's everyone so quiet?" The boy looked confused. He glanced at the room. "They always get quiet sometimes." Capone raised an eyebrow. "When?" The boy thought for a moment. "When they're scared." Silence deepened. Capone looked back at the child. "You scared?" The boy shook his head. "No." Capone leaned forward slightly. "Why not?" The boy answered without hesitation. "You haven't done anything." That landed hard. Capone sat back. No one spoke. No one moved. Capone reached into his pocket and placed money on the counter, far more than the meal cost. The boy's eyes widened. "That's too much." Capone studied him. "Is it?" The boy pushed the money back. That's not right. The room seemed to crack. Capone stared at the boy, searching for something. Defiance, calculation, fear? He found none. He stood up slowly. The sound of the stool scraping back felt louder than it was. Capone adjusted his coat. He looked at the man behind the counter. "You've raised him well," Capone said. Then he looked back at the boy. "Don't let the city teach you the wrong lessons." He turned and walked out. The bell rang. The door closed. The diner breathed again. The boy watched the door for a long moment. "What was that about?" he asked. No one answered. Outside, Capone paused on the sidewalk. He didn't look back, but something had followed him out of that diner. Not fear.
The diner returned to its rhythm slowly, as if the walls themselves needed time to remember what normal felt like. Plates were cleared, coffee refilled, the door opened and closed again. But something fundamental had shifted. The boy felt it in the way his father avoided his eyes, in the way his mother's hands trembled when she wiped the counter, in the way customers lingered longer than usual without saying why. Fear had not left the room with Al Capone. It had rearranged itself. When the lunch crowd thinned, the boy sat on a stool behind the counter, swinging his legs, humming quietly. To him, the encounter already felt distant, like a strange interruption in an otherwise ordinary day. To his parents, it felt like a stone dropped into deep water, its ripples still spreading outward. They closed the diner early that afternoon. No discussion, no explanation. His father simply flipped the sign and locked the door with more care than usual. Outside, the street looked the same as it always had, but his mother held his hand tighter as they walked home. The boy noticed but said nothing. He was learning that silence sometimes mattered. At home, the apartment felt smaller than it had that morning. The walls pressed in, carrying the weight of unspoken thoughts. His father sat at the table, hat still on, staring at the wood grain as if answers might rise from it. His mother moved between the stove and the sink, busy without purpose. "Did I do something bad?" the boy finally asked. Both parents froze. His mother turned first, kneeling so her eyes met his. She searched his face carefully, as if making sure he was still untouched. "No," she said softly, "you didn't do anything bad." His father cleared his throat. "You did something dangerous." The word hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar. The boy thought about this. Why? His father didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was quiet. "Because people let them." That night, the city felt louder than usual. Cars passed below their window more often. Voices echoed in the stairwell. Every sound carried intention. The boy lay awake on his mattress, listening, replaying the moment again and again. He remembered the man's eyes, not angry, not kind, just focused. He didn't feel scared thinking about him. That confused him. Across the city, Al Capone sat alone in his office, jacket draped over the back of his chair. The room smelled of tobacco and paper. Men spoke outside his door in low voices, careful not to interrupt. Capone ignored them. He was replaying the same moment, too, from the opposite end of the counter.
He had walked into countless rooms like that diner. He had watched people shrink, submit, perform fear without being asked. It had never surprised him. What surprised him now was how clean the boy's refusal had been. No accusation, no challenge, just certainty. Right and wrong defined without fear. Capone poured himself a drink and didn't touch it. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the father behind the counter. Proud man, trapped between survival and principle. Capone had seen that look before, usually right before it disappeared. The next morning, Capone drove past the diner without stopping. He watched from the car as the family unlocked the door, as the boy skipped ahead, as the father scanned the street before stepping inside. Capone noticed something else, too. Two men across the street pretending to read newspapers. Not his men. He recognized the posture immediately. That irritated him. Inside the diner, the boy worked as usual, but the room no longer felt neutral. Customers glanced at the door too often. Conversation stayed shallow. Fear had become cautious, waiting for instruction. The boy sensed it again, the invisible pressure, and this time it unsettled him. Not because he understood it, but because it was aimed at him. By mid-afternoon, a man he didn't recognize sat at the counter. He didn't order, he just watched. The boy wiped the counter slowly, pretending not to notice. His father stood closer than usual, pretending to rearrange shelves. The man finally spoke. "You're the kid." The boy looked at him. "I guess." The man smiled thinly. "You talk a lot." The boy shrugged. "Only when people ask." The man's smile faded. He stood, left a coin on the counter, and walked out. The boy stared at the coin long after he was gone. That evening, Capone returned home with a decision forming quietly in his chest. He understood now that the boy had become visible, and visibility in Chicago was never accidental. If he did nothing, others would fill the silence, and they would not be gentle. The boy hadn't challenged him, but the city would punish him anyway if left unchecked. Capone didn't see himself as a protector. He never had. But he understood balance, and this balance had been disturbed, not by violence, by innocence. He finished his drink at last and stood, pulling on his coat. Tomorrow, he would go back, not to eat, not to be seen, but to correct something the city had already begun to bend in the wrong direction. And the boy, lying awake again in his small apartment, felt a strange certainty settle over him. Something was coming. Not bad, not good, just heavy. And for the first time, he understood that being noticed could change everything.
By the third day, the city had adjusted its posture, not openly, not dramatically, but enough for those who paid attention to feel it. The diner was no longer just a place to eat. It had become a point of interest, and interest in Chicago was never neutral. People came in pairs now, not alone. Some sat where they could see the door. Others avoided the counter entirely. The boy noticed these changes the way children notice weather, without naming it, but preparing for it anyway. His father noticed more. He spoke less, watched more. Each time the bell rang, his shoulders tightened just a little. He began sending the boy to the kitchen on vague errands whenever unfamiliar faces lingered too long. The mother said nothing, but her silence had edges now. At night, she folded laundry slowly, carefully, as if order might keep danger outside the door. The boy felt the weight without understanding its source. He asked fewer questions. He listened more. He learned that the room reacted to him before it reacted to anyone else. That was new. That was uncomfortable. Across the street, the watchers changed. Not the same men as before. Different faces, similar posture. Capone recognized the pattern immediately when he passed by again. He did not slow down this time. He did not stop, but he cataloged everything. The angle of their shoulders, the way their eyes followed the window, the patience in their stillness. These were men waiting for permission. Capone felt irritation sharpen into resolve. He had not meant to involve the boy beyond that first moment, but the city had other plans. It always did. Innocence, once exposed, became a liability. People mistook it for leverage. Inside the diner, a A small incident unfolded that afternoon, small enough that no one would remember it later, but sharp enough to matter. A customer raised his voice over a spilled cup. Nothing severe, nothing violent. The boy rushed to clean it, apologizing too quickly. The man's anger softened when he realized who he was speaking to. He looked around the room, gauging reactions, then sat back down, embarrassed. The boy cleaned in silence. The room exhaled. His father stepped in front of him without a word. That night, after closing, the family stayed longer than usual. They sat at one of the tables, not eating, just being together. The boy traced patterns in the wood with his finger. "Why do people look at me like that now?" he asked. His parents exchanged a glance that carried years in it. His father spoke carefully. "Because you didn't act the way they expected." The boy frowned. "Is that bad?" "No," his mother said, "but it can be dangerous." The boy considered this. "I don't want to be dangerous." His father reached across the table and placed a hand over his son's. "Neither do we." Elsewhere, Capone made his move, not loudly, not publicly. He spoke to the right people in the right order, using the language the city understood. Not threats, boundaries, the kind that didn't need repetition. He made it clear that the diner was not to be tested, not to be measured, not to be used as a message board for anyone else's ambition. The city listened. By morning, the watchers were gone. The boy noticed first. The street felt normal again. People returned to their routines. Laughter came back in small doses. The counter felt like a counter again, not a stage. He worked with lighter hands, unaware of the correction that had taken place overnight. Capone did not return that day or the next. He allowed distance to do its work. He understood that presence was powerful, but absence, used correctly, could be stronger. The family felt the change without understanding its source. Relief arrived quietly. His father slept better. His mother hummed again while cooking. The boy laughed more freely, his questions returning, curiosity reclaiming space. But something remained unresolved. Capone knew it, the city knew it, and somewhere deep down, the boy felt it too, a loose thread waiting to be tied. Because some corrections required more than silence. They required acknowledgement. And that moment was still ahead.
The city did not apologize when it backed away. Chicago never did. It simply moved on, the way a river moves on after swallowing a stone, the surface smoothing itself as if nothing had disturbed it. The diner returned to its usual rhythm first, in small, almost embarrassing ways. The bell above the door rang and nobody flinched. A chair scraped and nobody mistook it for warning. Someone laughed too loudly and nobody rushed to silence them. The boy noticed these changes the same way he noticed the weather turning, not by charts or predictions, but by how his own shoulders sat differently, how his breath came easier, how the room felt less like it was waiting for something to happen. His father noticed it too, but in a deeper, more cautious way. The first morning he unlocked the door without scanning the street twice, he paused as if he'd committed a mistake. He stood there with the key still in his hand, eyes lingering on the corner where the watchers had once been. His mother watched him from inside, hands resting on the counter, her expression unreadable. They didn't speak about it, but they shared the same silent understanding. Relief could be a trap if you trusted it too quickly. The boy went back to being a boy, which was not as simple as it sounds. For days he had carried a strange attention without knowing what it was. Even after that attention faded, the memory of it stayed in his body. He still looked up too fast when the bell rang. He still listened too closely to the tone of adults' voices. He still noticed when customers avoided the counter, even when they did it out of habit rather than fear. But the heaviness began to loosen. He began to hum again without meaning to. He began to ask questions that had nothing to do with danger. He began to complain about schoolwork and laugh at jokes that weren't particularly funny,
the way children do when they're returning to the simple truth of their own age. It was late afternoon when the final movement of the story began, and it began quietly, with nothing more dramatic than light shifting through the diner windows. The sun sat low, turning the glass into a pale rectangle on the floor. Dust floated in it, visible only when you bothered to look. Outside, cars passed, people walked. The city continued its usual performance of urgency. Inside, the cook was wiping his hands, the mother was counting coins from the register, and the father was fixing a loose hinge on a cabinet door. The boy leaned on the counter, watching his father work, fascinated by how adults could stare at a problem for a long time and then suddenly make it change with one small twist. The bell rang. At first, no one reacted, not with fear, not with submission, not with tension. The sound was just the sound it had always been. Then the father looked up, just instinct, and his face changed by a fraction. His hands didn't shake, but they stopped moving. The mother's fingers paused over the coins. The boy glanced toward the door, not anxious, only curious. Al Capone stepped inside. He came alone. That detail alone altered the air. Not the old freezing dread, not the panic of watchers, but something sharper and harder to name. Adults recognized him even when they wished they didn't. They recognized him the way you recognize fire, not always by sight, but by what it does to everything around it. Yet the room did not seize up. It held. People stayed seated. A man near the window looked down at his coffee instead of bolting. Someone at a corner table pretended to keep eating. There was fear still, yes, but it was quieter, less performative. It had been disciplined by whatever invisible correction had happened the night the watchers vanished.
Capone's coat was dark, his hat pulled low, his movements unhurried. He took in the room with the same calm attention as before, but his gaze lingered a touch longer on the faces. He was reading not the diner, but the story the diner had become. He could see the echoes of what had nearly happened. He could see the father standing straighter than he had any right to. He could see the mother's composure held together by practice. He could see the boy's eyes, open and steady, not startled by reputation, because the boy still did not truly understand what reputation meant. The boy spoke first, as he always did, because in his world, a customer was a customer until proven otherwise. "Counter or table?" he asked. Capone looked at him, and for the first time there was something like softness behind his eyes. Not sentimentality, not tenderness, a recognition that this child was unchanged, and that was the rarest thing Capone had ever encountered. "Counter," he said. The boy wiped the counter carefully, the way his mother had taught him, as if cleanliness could be a kind of respect. Capone sat. The stool creaked, but nobody flinched. That small fact mattered more than anyone in the room wanted to admit. The boy poured a glass of water and placed it down with care. "Soup's still good," he said, almost proud. Capone's mouth twitched. "I figured," he replied. The boy waited. He didn't ask questions this time, not yet. He watched Capone the way he watched people who carried stories, sensing there was something to learn, even if he didn't know the shape of it. Capone looked past the boy toward the kitchen opening. The father had returned to the cabinet hinge, but his hands moved slowly, deliberately, as if speed might betray fear. The mother stood near the register, shoulders relaxed, but her eyes stayed on Capone in quick, careful glances. Capone placed a modest amount of money on the counter. Not a gift, not an insult. The boy glanced at it and nodded. "Okay," he said, and called the order into the kitchen. The cook looked up, saw Capone, and swallowed hard, but his hands did not shake. He ladled soup with controlled movements, another small fact that mattered. Capone's presence did not dominate the room the way it could have. He allowed the diner to breathe around him. He had always understood that power was not only in the ability to crush a place, but in the ability to sit inside it without needing to prove anything. Yet he had not come for soup, not really. He had come because something about the diner had slipped into his mind and refused to leave. He had come because the boy's words had followed him into other rooms, and the city had responded in ways Capone did not enjoy. He had come because he wanted to know whether his correction had truly held, and because there was one final part of balance that could not be restored by absence alone. When the soup arrived, Capone tasted it. He nodded once, acknowledging the boy's earlier confidence without making it a performance. The boy watched him eat, oddly satisfied, as if he had passed a test. Capone set the spoon down and spoke quietly, careful not to turn the room into an audience. "You ever want to leave this place?" he asked. The boy blinked, surprised by the question. He looked around the diner, the familiar stools, the chipped counter edge, the smudge on the window his mother never seemed to notice. He thought about his friends at school, about the bigger streets, about the idea of trains and distant cities that sounded like stories. "Sometimes," he said honestly. Then he added, almost as if explaining something obvious, "But it needs us." Capone's eyes moved again toward the father and mother. He understood the boy's answer in a way the boy didn't. The child spoke in simple terms. The truth beneath it was heavy. This diner was their anchor, their income, their identity, and in a city like Chicago, anchors could be cut. Capone leaned back slightly. "That's a lot for a kid to carry," he said. The boy frowned. "It's not heavy," he insisted, because children often insist on things they shouldn't have to. Then he hesitated and added, quieter, "It was heavier when people kept looking." Capone's gaze sharpened. "They were looking at you?" The boy nodded, "Like I did something." Capone did not react outwardly. He had already suspected it. Hearing it confirmed from the child's mouth made it feel uglier. Chicago had a talent for punishing innocence the moment it attracted attention. Adults were trained to understand threats. Children were not, and that made them vulnerable in ways Capone found irritating, even when he didn't want to admit why. Capone glanced around the room again, not seeking faces, seeking the mood. He could feel their curiosity, their fear, their hunger for a scene. Capone did not give them one. Instead, he reached into his coat and removed something small, folded, plain. Not money, paper. He placed it on the counter between himself and the boy. The boy stared at it. "What's that?" he asked. Capone's voice stayed low. "Something you won't need unless the city forgets how to behave." The boy did not touch it at first. He looked at Capone's face, searching for clues, and found none. Capone's expression was calm, controlled, unreadable, but there was something different in the stillness. Not intimidation, decision.
The father took one step forward from the kitchen opening before stopping himself. The mother's hands tightened around the coins she was counting. The cook pretended to wipe the same spot on the counter twice. The room held its breath, waiting for the familiar shape of trouble. The boy finally reached for the paper and unfolded it carefully as if it might tear. His eyes scanned it. He didn't fully understand what he was reading at first. He looked up again, confused. "This is for us?" he asked. Capone nodded once. "It's for the place," he said, "which is the same thing." The boy's mouth opened as if he wanted to ask a dozen questions, but he didn't. He looked down again, then toward his parents. His father's face was pale, but he did not look away. His mother's eyes glistened, but she did not cry. The boy didn't know what he was witnessing, only that it mattered. Capone pushed the folded paper back toward the boy. "Keep it under the counter," he said. "If anyone comes here looking to use you again, you show it. You don't argue, you don't explain, you just show it." The boy nodded slowly, absorbing instructions like a student, because children trusted rules even when they didn't understand the world that made the rules necessary. Capone stood. The stool scraped back, but again nobody flinched. The room did not panic. It watched, tense but contained. Capone adjusted his coat and turned, not toward the door yet, but toward the room itself. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Silence made his words sharper. "This place," he said, calm and measured,
is not a stage. Every face in the diner seemed to tighten. Even those pretending not to listen could not escape the shape of his attention. No one here is auditioning, not for courage, not for loyalty, and not for your entertainment. He let the words land, then added with a slight pause that made the air feel colder, especially not a child. The room swallowed hard. Capone's eyes moved from table to table. He did not glare, he did not threaten. He simply looked at people as if he could see the small compromises that made fear possible. His gaze was not violence, it was judgment without anger, which was more unsettling. If you came here to measure something, you've measured enough. He turned back toward the counter and looked at the boy again. His voice softened by a fraction, not becoming gentle, simply becoming direct. You didn't do anything wrong, he told him. The boy nodded. I know, he said, but it was more a hope than certainty. Capone leaned slightly closer. Good, he replied. Hold on to that. He looked at the father then. The proud man behind the counter met Capone's eyes, and the room felt the tension between them like a wire pulled tight. The father's throat worked as he swallowed. His hands were open at his sides, not fists, not pleading, simply ready. Capone spoke to him without drama. Keep your doors open, he said. The father's voice came out rough. We try, he said. Capone nodded once, as if the answer pleased him. Try is enough, and he turned toward the door. The bell rang as he left. The door closed behind him, and for a long moment, nobody moved. The boy folded the paper and slid it beneath the counter as instructed, hands careful, as if he were placing something fragile away from harm. The cook exhaled. Someone at a table finally lifted their coffee cup and drank. A chair shifted. Life began again, awkwardly at first, then with increasing confidence. The father leaned against the counter, eyes closed for half a second, then opened them and looked at his son. The boy looked back, confused by the intensity in his father's gaze. Did I do it right? He asked quietly. The father's face softened, and the softness looked painful. Yeah, he said, you did. The mother came to the counter and knelt beside the boy, smoothing his hair. Her hands trembled now that the moment had passed. You don't know what you just did, she whispered. The boy frowned. I just talked, he said. She pressed her lips together, holding herself together. Sometimes that's enough, she replied. That night, the family walked home again together. The city felt less sharp, as if someone had filed down the edges. Still dangerous, still loud, still unpredictable, but momentarily corrected. The father held his son's hand. The mother stayed close on the other side. The boy stared up at streetlights, thinking about how adults carried invisible weights that kids only felt when they brushed against them. At home, the father sat at the table and finally removed his hat, like a man releasing tension. The mother poured tea. The boy sat between them, swinging his legs, feeling for the first time in days like the apartment could hold them without squeezing. What's his name? The boy asked suddenly. His parents froze. His father's eyes narrowed slightly. Whose? He asked, though he already knew. The man, the boy said. The one who ate soup. The mother's hands tightened around the cup. The father exhaled slowly. It's a name you don't need, he said carefully. The boy frowned. But everyone knows it. The father looked at him, and in that look was fear, pride, and something else. Relief. Yeah, he said, everyone knows it. The boy waited. The father's voice dropped. Al Capone, he said. The boy repeated it quietly, tasting the name like a new word. Al Capone, he said again. He didn't look scared. He looked thoughtful. Why are people scared of him? He asked. The mother answered this time. Because he can change things, she said. The boy nodded. He changed something here, he said, as if concluding a simple math problem. His father's jaw tightened. He could have changed it the other way, he replied. The boy looked down at his hands. But he didn't, he said softly. Silence stretched. The mother reached across the table and took her son's hand. No, she said, he didn't. Days passed. The diner stayed open. Customers returned to old habits. The counter regained its ordinariness. The boy went to school and complained about lessons. He ran down the stairs with friends. He laughed too loudly sometimes. Life resumed not because danger had vanished, but because people had been allowed, briefly, to live without being watched. Capone never returned to the diner after that, not openly, not to sit at the counter again. He didn't need to. He understood the lesson had landed where it mattered, not in headlines, not in rumor, but in behavior. The city had been reminded there were boundaries even fear had to respect, and that sometimes the most effective show of power was restraint. Once, weeks later, the boy saw a car idle at the corner for a moment, a dark coat inside, a hat. He couldn't be sure. The car moved on. The boy watched it disappear, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and gratitude he couldn't explain. He went back inside, wiped the counter, and asked the next customer, counter or table? Years later, historians would talk about Al Capone in the familiar ways. They would measure his violence, his ambition, his empire. They would argue about whether he was a monster or a product of his time. They would describe fear like it was the only thing he ever created. But they would not talk about the small diner near the river. They would not talk about a child behind a counter, refusing excess money because it wasn't right. They would not talk about the way the city leaned away and then corrected itself. Those things were too quiet for history, too human. Yet, for that family, the memory stayed sharp, not as admiration, not as a story to boast about, but as a strange proof that innocence could interrupt power long enough to reveal something underneath it, that even men like Capone could be forced, by the simple clarity of a child, to choose what kind of shadow they wanted to cast. The boy grew older. He learned what the name meant. He learned why his parents had gone quiet that night at the table. He learned that the world was not fair, that fear had its own economy, that power could bend a city. But he never forgot the part that mattered most, the moment a room full of adults held its breath and a child spoke anyway, and the world did not end. In Chicago, that counted as a miracle.